So I am here with Dan Lukasik, and this is officially episode 7 of Escaping the Undertow. And, and before I've dealt generally with mental health more generally, but today I want to specifically talk about lawyers and mental health. And I'll just kind of give you, Dan, an update on this, and then you can kind of talk a little bit about your background. Um, I attended a conference Friday of last week, actually, and it was the first mental health conference for lawyers that I think we've had in New Brunswick. And I had sent you a week ago an executive summary of the report done at Sherbrooke University. And part of that report um, talks about just the astounding statistics about lawyers in Canada and depression and anxiety and burnout and all kinds of very difficult issues. And it was really neat. What happened on Friday is we had two judges and several lawyers and a few former lawyers talking about either their past struggles or just their experiences with mental health. And one of the things that happened kind of partway through is that one lawyer stood up and kind of said, listen, I've been to hundreds of these conferences, and this is kind of the best one that I've ever been to. And this is the first time that this has happened. And it was so intense at parts where, in a good way, that I actually had to go out and kind of take a walk and catch my breath because it really felt for the first time that we as a profession, certainly the local bar in New Brunswick, we're acknowledging how serious a problem we have and talking about it. And it was just incredible. You can almost feel it in the room how it was almost like people are finally talking about it and not just trying to be machines or gladiators, as one would call it. So I guess just to start with that, tell us a little bit about your experience and how you got into dealing online. You're a big advocate, the website Lawyers with Depression, and you started that many years ago. You speak all across uh, the US, from what I know, and into Canada as well. And I guess you just did a documentary. So tell me a little bit about your path to where you
Sure.
are today.
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me, Tim. And I've been a lawyer for 35 years or so. I'm about 61. I was a trial lawyer for almost 30 years. And for the past 4 years, I've been the New York State Judicial Wellness Coordinator. I was appointed by the New York State Office of Court Administration by our chief judge. And I'm responsible for developing, implementing, delivering wellness programming for our 2,000 trial level court judges in New York State.
Wow.
Yeah, and I travel a lot all around. I spent a lot of time in New York City, but I think that where we're at now and why I'm involved is when I was 40, I was the managing partner at our litigation firm, and I was diagnosed with major depression. And I think there's a lot of complicated reasons for that. Sometimes I'm asked a lot, does being aware cause depression? Does it cause anxiety? Does it cause burnout?
A little
And
bit
I
of
think,
chicken or egg, isn't it?
yeah, and I think it's a little bit more complicated than that. I think what I think is true is that we as law students, lawyers, judges bring into the profession certain risk factors. The two biggest risk factors for anybody, let alone lawyers, to develop those conditions is a genetic predisposition. They think that's at least 50% of it. And the other is a history of family trauma or neglect. I have both. My family tree is populated by people with mental health and addiction problems. And I also grew up in a traumatic home. My dad was an abusive alcoholic. And then when you go into the legal profession, I think, as a trial lawyer, it was filled with conflict and very high stress loads and not a lot of time to take good care of myself. And I just didn't have the best coping strategies. And I call it what happened, the perfect storm of all these things coming together to
Hmm.
create major depression. And I think that's, if we had, it's almost like the archaeology of your mind. If we could go inside everybody's mind who struggles with these conditions, we'd find some of these qualities or factors to varying degrees.
Yeah, and the A-type personalities in the first place. are
Yes.
predisposed to professions like law. We're already a little bit, I don't want to say wired differently, but certainly very type A and like certain amount of order and things like that.
I think that's true, Tim, and I think, that's maybe in some sense a prerequisite,
Exactly.
you have to be that way because otherwise you might not survive it. You have to have some of those instincts to overachieve, to get into law school, to pass the bar, to practice law. It's a demanding profession. I also say it's a very rewarding profession. I teach a class on mental health and well-being at our law school here in Buffalo. I have about 50 students. And I tell them, I'm not here to say, don't go into law. Law is an awful profession. I think it's a great profession in many respects, and some of the best times of my life have been as a lawyer. But at the same time, it's equally true that it has some really inherent, unique risk factors that require maybe some robust and unique responses that's different than other kinds of jobs or professions.
And what was it that how did this start with the judicial wellness coordinator? I think that's just incredible that, obviously the state bar in New York is recognizing that there's a huge problem and taking steps to fix
Mhm.
that. And so how was that role created?
Sure. Well, it was created before I took the role. I was appointed by our chief judge, and it's not through the New York State Bar Association. It's through the New York State Office of Court Administration. So the court system, the court structure itself, appointed me 4 years ago. And, I think that it's widely recognized throughout the profession with all the studies and statistics that we've got a problem, and we've got a big problem. And I think that not only does it have to do with quality of life and productivity, but as the National Task Force here in the US said, it's a question of competency. And I
Yeah.
think that's where the rubber meets the road, where the alarm bells go off and say, wow, these conditions can affect someone's competency, can result in, people not being able to carry out their ethical obligations to their clients or grievances or malpractice claims. So it's much more than just getting some therapy or taking some pills and being okay. It cuts across the entire profession.
Yeah, and that was certainly a big part of the conference that we were at. There were members of the Law Society in New Brunswick there, and then also in Nova Scotia, members of their equivalent to the Law Society who have more of a competence fitness to practice stream, instead of just looking at a disciplinary or conduct kind of stream. They actually have the tools to deal with that, and so it's obvious that other provinces and states are looking at it the same way. That it's a little bit sad that it takes that amount of practicality to actually do something, but really it doesn't matter to me why we do those things. It's just that we're actually starting to take the right steps now.
You're right, so right, Tim, that it has to get to that level. But yourself from looking at this situation, and I have over years, sometimes lawyers are not the best at getting help, and there's lots of reasons, but they so often wait till the wheel falls off to get help, and it might come in the form of a grievance or malpractice claim, but just as more likely or more likely, their wife leaves them, or they're estranged from their children, or
Mhm.
anything can happen.
So have you found, just to start, can you tell me a little bit about, you went through the major depression, and then how did you get started with your website, and what kind of things kind of drew
Sure.
you to the support of that?
Well, it's been a while now, but about 15 years ago, after I call it relatively recovered from depression because it's an ongoing management issue, is, I encountered stigma myself. We're at a different time in our culture generally and in the legal culture in terms of stigma. And so, stigma hurts, and it hurt me. And, here I was a partner, and I still, encountered stigma. So at first it really hurt me, and then it made me angry, and I wanted to do something about it. So I launched this website, Lawyers with Depression, which 15 years ago was the first website of its kind, I think globally. And I really launched it to kind of be a place, a virtual home where people could go to learn about mental health, especially as it affects lawyers. And it was also a place where I could, creatively make sense of my experiences as a lawyer practicing law while at the same time managing depression. So that's what happened. And then it went kind of, it mushroomed out of there. And, now over the last, I lecture around the country and, I've been to Harvard, Yale, corporations, big law firms, small law firms. Um, so to me, it's all kind of a mystery because I'm really just a simple guy from the country. But I guess maybe for whatever reason, I've always believed that it's important to be of service to other people. My parents taught me that, and so all those years ago, I started on this path in no way, shape, or form thinking I would end up here, doing all this advocacy work. But I really must say, now it's become my full-time job. But I get a tremendous amount of meaning and purpose out of doing this kind of work, and I'm very fortunate, to be a part of a solution, I think.
Do you experience any stigma now, or has that mostly gone away?
I think as I told my law students, I think over the last 20 years, the issue of stigma has really evolved and changed. I think we're at a much better place than we were, even 5 years ago. And I think because lots of times, stigma in my mind is about silence and shame. We don't say anything, we don't help. And, the sufferer is left to assume, they have something to be ashamed of, that it's their fault. And I think now what I find, Tim, is more like people are silent, not because they're shaming somebody, though that could be true. It's that they want to help, but they don't know what to do or what to say. And
Right.
I think that's been a profound cultural shift generally, because now it's way out in the open where, uh, you know, people, lawyers, their teenage kids have depression or anxiety or suicidal ideation, or their elderly parents. So I think it's not just in the legal profession, but way more out in the open.
Right. What kind of people have you talked to? Have people kind of come up to you and talk to you about their personal experiences? Have you found that being more open about your own experiences has kind of allowed you to hear more from others about what their experiences are?
I guess it's a mixed bag. That's a good question, Tim, because sometimes, you know, nobody says anything. And then sometimes people come up afterward and say something. I think that now as time has gone by, I'm of the opinion that for myself, I just try to throw good energy out into the universe. I hope that doesn't sound too hippy yippy,
No,
but
not at all. I'm all about good energy.
and I just have faith that I'm just planting the seeds. And I've had many situations over the years where someone will come up to me and say, I heard you talk 3.5 years ago at a CLE, and it really affected me. And, but I would say much, much more often, you just don't know, how it affects people. But I just have this faith that, I want to be part of the solution. And I think saying, talking as a lawyer, I'm hoping it brings me more credibility, just like you talking about it, Tim. And I
Hmm.
think it gives people permission to talk about it, whether it be with you and I or with their spouse or their therapist.
For sure. And it's interesting. So you're speaking to court staff, but also judges as well.
Primarily judges. My
Okay.
task, we have 15,000 employees in New York State. So when I was appointed 4 years ago, it was specifically for the 2,000 judges. but now, that's kind of grown too. And now I'm giving presentations for court clerks, for deputies, courtroom deputies, um, leadership teams. So it's grown because I think it's a human thing, I mean, yes,
Right.
it is a lawyer thing, clearly, or this is the shape of it, but it's a human thing that people can relate to. And just like your experience in New Brunswick, I think people feel a sense of relief when the cat's out of the bag.
Yeah, and one of the neat things, there were two judges, former Chief Justice Strathy, who was the Chief Justice in Ontario until I think until about a year ago, and then Judge Tim Daly, who was from Nova Scotia, from Pictou County, Nova Scotia, and it was Judge Daly talked specifically about his own depression,
Wow.
and
Mm,
difficulties after losing his wife. And Judge
wow.
Strathy talked about his mother, and mental illness in the family, and then in the bar, and seeing those kinds of things. And it was, you could almost feel, um, almost like a collective exhale in the room for people to say, wow, these people who are in such, what you might say, positions of authority, are admitting these things, and it gives everybody else in the room an ability to kind of be a little bit more open and talk about those things. And I wonder if you've seen any similar experiences, in
Uh,
New York, or whether or not
yeah, that's a
are
great
people still
question.
quiet?
Well, no, that's a really great issue, Tim, because I think, the next big step forward, we're moving, this idea of self-care, of getting help. I mean, that message has been out there now for a good 3, 4, 5 years. And now the next step is, okay, we get it, but what is the organization going to do? What is the law firm going to do? What is the
Right.
court system going to do? Because you could do all the self-care tips you want, but if you work in an workplace that doesn't support good mental health,
Hmm.
you know, there's limits to what you can achieve. So in New York State, and a lot of other states, the thrust is on the implementation of a lawyer well-being committee, made up of, so at a typical law firm, it might be 3 lawyers, 3 partners, and 3 support staff. And the
Hmm.
idea is to create an infrastructure to drive incremental positive change forward. So rather than CLEs on these topics at firms being a one-off or a two-off every year,
Right.
they have ongoing program. They have policies at the firm that support this. They make it part of their retention and recruitment policy. So I think that's the next wave coming, and I think that's underway, albeit slowly. But I think that's going to be the next 3 years, the next big thing.
Here's what would, if you could say you've accomplished kind of one thing, in your advocacy work, what would that be?
I think, to be honest, I think when I think about it, is I think I've made it relatable, that made depression relatable. Like, oh, he's one of us. I'm this big bald headed guy from Buffalo. And, I look like, I guess some people don't know me, said, oh, you must be a lawyer. You look like a lawyer, whatever that looks like. So I guess bald and chubby and wearing a suit. But I think I think my sense is that in my, um, I'm an average person. I've lived with these conditions, and I think that it makes it relatable to them, because if it's not relatable to them, we're not making much of an impact. If it's just, if I were to be a therapist or a psychiatrist or a mental health expert, I'm not any of those things. Though those people have an important role to play, but I think people have to be able to see their own stories in your story, and vice
Right.
versa. you know that's
Right.
where impact happens.
Have you found that your own mental health has improved significantly since you've kind of taken these steps, or is it something that
Yeah,
you think you'll always battle?
I think I'm doing very well. I think I have been for quite good number, quite some time, probably now, the last 5, 10 years. I liken it to like it's always in the periphery, in the background someplace. But in the worst days, when I was in major depression, I was in like the basement of it, like a 10 out of 10. Now, if it does happen, there are long stretches where I don't feel any depression and life's going well. But if I do experience it, it's like a 3 out of 10,
Right.
and it also doesn't go on as long as it used to. It might be like a few days or something like that. But I think it's taken me a long time to put it all together, I think, and a lifetime of therapy, going to support groups, a medication, of doing meaningful work. I think that's just a source of distress for a lot of lawyers and law students and judges. Where
Trying to find that purpose.
yeah, because if it, you get in that space, Tim, and you've met people like this where life feels meaningless or your job feels meaningless. I mean, if you have these other kind of risk factors, it's not a good place to go. It's not a good rabbit hole to go down.
Right. What would your advice be to kind of young law students, young lawyers, who are kind of starting out and already maybe predisposed to depression? What are some things that you think would be helpful?
Well, one thing I think is true is that I sense we just had a big article in the New York Times here about loneliness in America, and our U.S. Surgeon General wrote on a huge article about it and about the mental and psychological and physical implications of that. And I think that's something that plagues the legal profession, a sense of loneliness. And I think the younger generation are moving away from interconnectedness, from
Hmm.
camaraderie, from being part of their legal community. Being on a Facebook page, of lawyers is not the same as
No, it's
going
not at
to,
all.
yeah, going to like committee meeting for your bar association, or going to a social event of your bar association. I think they have to be more deliberate and intentional about creating or joining community. I think, a lot of older partners and lawyers I know say the young lawyers spend way too much time just in their office. They don't, bar associations around the US are kind of really suffering and struggling because the younger people aren't joining them.
I was thinking about this last week, and I was thinking about why was it that that conference that I was at so different um, than some others, and part of the answer to me was people were being authentic, right? Like there's almost a baked in um, tension a little bit. I don't want to speak ill of the profession, but there's
No,
almost like there's a baked in, like, in some ways, sense of importance that does not draw people in. It kind of, it makes people afraid to talk to other people, or they
that's
don't
true.
reach out as much. And so there was something really different about people in a room talking about tough topics like that and admitting that, hey, this isn't always sunshine and roses. It's a pretty tough gig sometimes,
Yeah,
that
very.
allow. And I wonder if that's it. We're not connecting anymore because it's hard to. We're not exactly the easiest crew of people to connect with all the time. We're caught
Well,
in our own heads half the time.
yeah, I think that's a good insight. I think that was true even earlier sometimes, but I do believe that, there used to be multiple occasions for people to bump into each other, even,
Mhm.
in the legal community, even with your adversaries. And, today I get the sense that a lot of people don't know each other, don't know their adversary. And it
Mhm.
makes it much easier to objectify them, to have incivility, to have misunderstandings. When everything is in email and there's no discussion, that doesn't lend itself well to good outcomes, really. I think
No.
for both sides. But I think that, um, and that is unique about lawyering, where there's winners and losers. And I think we want everybody to think we're winners, but inside many of us feel, if not losers, we feel like we're losing, and I say to the judges, you're at the pinnacle of your profession, many would say. But if I were to look at around the room and have thought bubbles above your heads, like the cartoons, it's amazing how many of you would feel that, yeah, I'm not good enough. I'm not smart enough. I think that's
Do you think that? Because
I think so, in the sense that there is a problem, I think, because it's so
mm,
competitive that many I had this experience where a lawyer came up to me who was retiring from the court system, a confidential clerk to the judge, and beloved guy, worked for a big firm, very smart, funny Irish guy. And he said, Dan, you gave a talk a year ago, and today's my last day on the job. I'm retiring today. I go, oh, wow, congratulations. Didn't know. And he goes, you remember you were talking about the imposter syndrome? I go, yeah. Because that was true my whole life. That's been me my whole life.
really,
Oh, wow. Wow. I said,
yeah,
amazing. So I think that you could say it plays into this motivation to be better. We're type A personalities, we're overachievers. And, if we're constantly, feeling like we got to work harder and harder and harder to keep up, that might explain some of it, and the profession does expect winners and losers, even though we have arbitration and mediation, it's still, I think, still focused on winning.
yeah. Well, that's really interesting that somebody in that position um, would have that kind of imposter syndrome because you would
Yeah.
think, I guess it's you always think that everybody else has it all together, and it's
Well, that's
you
it.
know
That's we think that, my daughter in law school, one of the things I had done with my class, they had to write a 5-page paper, Tim, at the end of the semester, telling me what they've learned from the class. Confidential, for my eyes only. You'd
mhm.
be shocked what kind of things they said.
Wow.
That they're you know they don't get law school, everyone else is smarter, everyone's more accomplished, I'm not on law review, what am I doing here? Many and many of them struggle with this sense that they're not good enough. And sometimes, the messaging from career development centers or the profession is, how do I measure up? I'm not good enough. I'm not in the top 20%
Right,
of the class.
right. It's pretty hard to avoid those kind of feelings when you go in and you're based on a curve and you kind of know who's above you and who's below you, and from the get-go that it's almost baked in to set you up that way.
Totally, Tim. I think that's true. And, or in a firm culture where there's partners and junior partners and senior associates, and, in the big corporate world, billable hours, and, you see how you're measuring up with someone else in billable hours. So I think it's a competitive field, and I think the challenge is, can you live in that world and at the same time be healthy, mentally, physically healthy? And I think that's the challenge. And I think there's no right or wrong answer per se, but I think what you're describing, what just happened, you have to ask the important questions and then let people express themselves, you know.
Yeah, yeah. I have very hopeful. I'm cautiously optimistic
Me too.
about the future in the profession because it's who would have ever thought 10 or 15 years ago there would even be such a thing as a judicial wellness coordinator,
Well, I
right?
said to them, yeah, I was in New York City last week. I said, listen, 5 years ago, I wouldn't even be here. I would not be where I am now, talking to you about issues like depression and anxiety and or wellness or, um, and I do think, and I said to someone recently, this is a generational issue. So everybody like 35 or 40 and older is like, I was miserable, so you should be miserable, or
Right.
and the younger people below 40 and in law school all care deeply about wellness And they're the ones that are going to drive the future because they're the ones that are going to become the young partners, the leaders of the future. And I think that's going to, and people like you, Tim, to be honest, that's what's going to change the profession. So I think, we're in a cycle of change right now. And I think it's going to take, it's changing, but, you're turning a big ship here, a whole legal culture. And it's
Right.
going to take another 5 or 10 years to see its fullest potential, I think.
Good. Well, do you have any parting comments or anything that anything that you want to say that's come to mind?
Yeah, I something, when I try to think about what I've learned in my own life, and I'm always asking myself, I think with respect to depression, I think what's true about depression, it makes you feel helpless and hopeless. And they're vicious circle that feed one another. The more you feel helpless, the more you feel hopeless. And it's a very disempowering state of mind and being. And I think that's why I was tired all the time, and or you
Right.
didn't want to get out of bed. And I think part of recovery and staying well is seeing, and trying to help yourself. And when we do that, we feel more helpful. And when we do that, we feel more empowered. So that's how I think of when I think of mental health and well-being, that's how I think of it. Is if you're helpless and hopeless, you're on the low end of mental health and well-being. And if
Mhm.
you're helping yourself, or just as importantly, I would argue, helping someone else.
Well,
Uh,
and help, let's be clear, helping others to me is one of the best things you can do for your mental health in any case, because you get out of your own head.
1000%. I think
Mm,
that's been my lesson in life is that if it's just about ourselves, it's too small of a vision of who we can be.
mhm.
And I think, at the end of our lives, I've said this many times, it's going to be, where we've been of service to other people that's really going to matter. I
Yeah.
mean, in our personal and our professional lives, because the money and the accolade, it won't matter so much. So I always try to keep the long view in mind that is really what matters. And to the best I can, I try to devote my energy and time to that. And I think that makes me feel more like I'm moving in the right direction and hopeful.
Yeah. What, and the last question I guess I'll ask you is, you've done all these tours at different schools and presentations. What's something that just pops to your mind that's you've learned or somebody said during that kind of took you aback a little bit, that you didn't expect during one of
Yeah.
those presentations?
Yeah, that's I think a good question because I gave a presentation as continuing legal education. I think you call it different in Canada.
No, it's
But
same thing, CLE.
oh, okay,
Yep.
same thing.
We got to get
And
our points every year.
yep. And this is a firm of a couple hundred lawyers, and they had like 70 lawyers at the CLE I gave. And it went well. Afterwards, five women came up to me, no men. It's very interesting. They're all women.
Yeah.
They're all like senior associates. So they're all been there about 5 to 7 years. And they said to me, Dan, this is great, but what's next? I go, what do you mean? They said, well, where were the partners? Where was the firm leadership? Why weren't they here? So you can't fool people. They it made them doubtful that change would happen, that this was like a checkbox that the firm had to do. And
Right.
I think that spoke volumes about men and these issues, men of authority in these positions of power at firms, not willing to show their own vulnerability or
Mhm.
humanity, I'd say. And you know, the challenge to the firm leadership because all everyone at a firm looks to the leaders to see what's permissible and what's not. Is it permissible to take a day off for my mental health? Well, if they feel the leaders are not in favor of that, or even in a more general sense, if they feel a lot of people don't take vacations. Why not? Because the leader in their practice group or the partners don't take it themselves. So they look to the leaders to see what's okay and what's not okay. And if the leaders don't model that behavior, that also really limits change.
Well, I think they're going to have no choice eventually, because I
I
think we're in a
agree.
position where people just won't put up with it.
Well, I said to the firm leaders, I said, when I talked to these people at Harvard and Yale, these bright people, given a choice between great firm A and B, the firm that promotes well-being, mental health, that person is going to pick that firm over your firm every day of the week,
Right.
every day of the week. So if you're really smart, and I appeal to their business sense, you use it as part of your recruitment strategy, your retention strategy. Uh, Everybody, all these people want to be at those kind of firms. So I think that is, I don't know if it is in Canada, but you see that here quite a bit.
Yeah, I think it's changing that way, and I think that back when I was articling, it was definitely a situation where firms kind of had their pick. There were, now things have really switched, where it's now the lawyers and the young associates that there are so many jobs that are available, and it's hard to fill the jobs because lawyers can just do, there's so many options available that, so you can't afford to behave that way anymore, I don't think, and get away with it.
Well, that's interesting. And along these lines, it's like the diversity and inclusion issue. Firms cannot afford to not be sensitive to those issues and weave it into its recruitment and retention policy. So I think wellness is being interwoven now into the legal culture in a way it never was before. So that makes me cautiously optimistic too. Wow.
Well,
And
good.
knowing people like you, Tim,
Yeah, for sure. You as well. Thank
yes,
you.
yeah.
Well, I appreciate your time.